right. Tonight, we are moving on in our lessons of the seven churches of Asia to the church in Sardis. Sardis was a pretty interesting location. Sardis is one of the few archaeological projects that Americans are actually in charge of, as they are the ones doing the archaeological dig there in Sardis. The area around Sardis is breathtaking. It is beautiful in the mountains of Turkey. There in this area. We're inland. Let me go back to the map. You can see we're inland a little bit more. So here was Thyatira we looked at last week. Sardis is really kind of centralized in this region. And when we look at the letter to Sardis in Revelation chapter 3, it holds one of the most severe reproaches of all of the seven churches. And Revelation chapter 3 and verse 1, again, this is as Jesus is writing, and John is now taking and been instructed to take these letters to these churches. Here is the letter to the church of Sardis. To the angel of the church in Sardis write, he who has the seven spirits of God and the seven stars says this, I know your deeds, that you have a name, that you are alive, but you are dead. That's kind of a sad assessment that Jesus gives the church in Sardis. You have a reputation that you're alive, but in reality, you're dead. However, some of the rest of the letter, when we get to it, we're going to see that it shows that not everything is completely dead in Sardis. But first, there's more of a warning. In chapter 3, verse 2, Jesus continues. He says, wake up and strengthen the things that remain, which were about to die, for I have not found your deeds completed in the sight of my God. So remember what you have received and heard, and keep it, and repent. Therefore, if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what hour I will come to you. One of the things that's interesting about the letter to the church in Sardis is that persecution's not mentioned. False teaching's not mentioned. And we see that in the other letters, where they're dealing with the persecution and they're dealing with false teachers. That's not a part of what's mentioned in the church in Sardis. It seems that might not be one of the major issues that this church is dealing with. As Christians in the Roman Empire, we know that they would have constantly been under pressure. That's just the life of a Christian in the first century in the Roman Empire. However, there were locations in the empire where the local government officials, that they were not as strict. Maybe they themselves had been converted to Christianity. And they were in places, like we've seen the places like Ephesus and Pergamum, where the center of paganism and the center of the emperor worship and all that was going on. Well, that was going on in Sardis too. But there were places that we know in the Roman Empire that they didn't respond like some of the others. I think it was in Ephesus, and we talked about some of the persecution that was going on there. It was most likely one of the local officials that would have sent John into exile on Patmos. That wouldn't have been Caesar. But when John was in Ephesus and he was obviously he was causing a disruption. We know Paul caused a big disruption in Ephesus when he was there. And so this is probably just a way to here's one of the Christian leaders, let's just get him out of the way for a while, put him on an island, which was common practice for them back then. It wasn't just criminals that they did that. It was anybody that they needed to get out of the way. And And so John was on the island of Patmos for a while, but then he was also released and he was brought back. He was in Ephesus later on, where tradition tells us that he ultimately died in the city of Ephesus. But another interesting thing about Sardis, though, is that, like I said, Jesus doesn't mention the issue of the Nicolaitans or the false teachers or the Jezebels or those kinds of things that we see in some of these other letters. But before we take a closer look at what might have been causing the problems in the church in Sardis, let's take a look at the historical events behind the city, because I think that's going to help us understand why Jesus said what he said. As we've seen in the other cities, other letters, there are very specific things about that city, like in Pergamum. Write your name on a white stone. Well, the white stones were all over the city because of the Asclepion, the hospital where people were healed, and their names would be written on white stones, and their story about how they were healed. And so there was a direct connection with what Jesus said to them with what they saw every day. And so there's a direct connection here in Sardis that has a lot to do with very famous, at least in that part of the world, it was very famous historical event that took place in Sardis. Long before Christianity found its way into this area of the world, Sardis was once actually the capital city of the kingdom of Lydia. And in 548 BC, so let's think timeline, 548 BC. This is close to the time when Nebuchadnezzar is taking the people from Judah, Jerusalem, into captivity. Close, roundabout. And so just so you kind of get a biblical timeline, what's happening in the biblical account as to what's happening in this part of the world. And so in 548 BC, the kingdom of Lydia, it was almost as large as the modern day country of Turkey. There were roads that led from both Pergamum and from Smyrna. Both of those intersected right in the middle of Sardis. So this was a major city as far as the transportation of a lot of goods going through this area. And because of its central location in this part of the world, the kingdom of Lydia, it was renowned for its wealth and its ancient splendor. This led then to the legendary King Croesus. King Croesus, the Lydian king, he was known for his outrageous fortune. There was actually a saying that arose among the ancient people, and it's still used in that part of the world today, that when someone is as rich as Croesus, and just the wealth of this kingdom at that time, it probably rivaled King Solomon in the nation of Israel. Just gold just coming out of their ears. They had more than they knew what to do with. And the reason was because they got tons and tons of gold from the nearby Pactolus River, and they used that wealth to build this tremendous kingdom. As a matter of fact, the very first gold coins ever minted, this is some of the very first ones minted in Sardis. The practice of minting coins started in Sardis with King Croesus, and so along with the gold, there were orchards, there were fine textiles. They're not far from Thyatira, where the purple dye was made that was used extensively in a lot of their textiles. It was just a lot of things that they had going on in Sardis. Well, as with many cities that we've looked at, the seat of the city of Sardis was on the Acropolis. That's up there on the top of that mountain. Now, it's not there anymore. This would have been where the official buildings, a lot of temples, a lot of things. This is where the palace of the king would have been. It sat and overshadowed the city itself that sat down in the valley below it. And in ancient times, it was credited with being one of the only cities that was there was no one who was able to conquer it. It was built 1,150 feet up the side of the mountain. But today, the only thing that's left there now is a portion of a Byzantine wall that was built in a little later times. And you can see a little bit of that there as erosion now and everything has crumbled most of it. Most of it's not there anymore. But King Croesus, he thought that these mountaintop fortresses that he had here around the city of Sardis, he believed that they were impregnable, and which is ultimately what led to his defeat and the defeat of the city of Sardis. In 547 BC, the Persian army, the Persian emperor Cyrus the Great, who we also read about in the Bible, invaded the kingdom of Lydia, and Croesus didn't do anything. Croesus just sat in his palace up on the citadel, up on the Acropolis. He didn't bother to defend it because no one had ever breached the walls before. It just wasn't possible. And even the Persians, they struggled for months to try to figure out how to take down this palace that is up on this mountain. Well, the Greek historian Herodotus, he tells a very interesting story. He says that one day, while the Persian army was surrounding this fortress, trying to figure out a way to get into it, all of a sudden, some soldiers see a helmet rolling down the side of the mountain. They kind of hide themselves and just kind of watch to see what's going to happen. And what was happening here, one of the soldiers from the city of Sardis had fallen asleep, and he had dropped his helmet, and it rolled down the mountain. Well, he then ran down the mountain to retrieve his helmet. And those Persian soldiers, as they were watching him as he ran back up the mountain, they discovered that there was a secret entrance into the palace on that side of the mountain as they followed that soldier back up the mountain. Because of that, a few days later, the Persians, they created a diversion on another side of the mountain while the army climbed up that secret passageway on the east side, and they took control of the palace. Once they had control of the palace and the king, they had control of the city and everything else. And it was all because of a lack of focus and a lack of vigilance of one soldier that the Persians were able to conquer the fortress. Now, this story was well known throughout all of Greece and all of Asia Minor. And so when Jesus wrote to the city of Sardis, there in Revelation 3 and verse 3, everybody understood the reference. You remember what it said? Therefore, if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what hour I will come to you. It's very pointed. The people of Sardis knew exactly what that meant because that's what they were known for. And so what Jesus is doing is just simply using a historical event that they were famous for, and he's using it to drive home a point. But the question still is, what is the crux of the matter that was causing problems for the church? Why would Jesus give that kind of a warning? I think if we learn a little bit more about the city's history, it may give us a few more hints to better understand what was really going on inside the church. Well, after the Lydians, then there were the Persians. After the Persians conquered them, then the Greeks came on the scene. And then beginning with Alexander the Great, And later then with the Hellenistic Greek leaders, they made Sardis a very important city once again. And later the town was annexed by Pergamum. Sardis was becoming so powerful that Pergamum, they didn't conquer them, but politically they kind of took them over, so that they could kind of diminish their status a little bit so that Pergamum could remain one of the most important cities in the area. But when the Romans arrived, they began to build these massive buildings. And they began to improve the city's appearance. So that's what Romans did everywhere they went. Build big buildings, and that'll bring people back to your city. Well, these American archaeologists who have been there in the city of Sardis, they have been reconstructing many of these Roman structures, most of which make up Roman baths. I remember when we saw some of the pictures from Ephesus, I had a picture of just a bunch of clay pipes that were just stacked in a pile. If you remember seeing that. Well, these are those same type of clay pipes, but these are ones that were mortared into a wall. And so these were drainage pipes where rain would be able to run down off of the top of a building and down through, and they're still there. Those are 2,000 years old, and they're still there and they still work. And so it just, like I said, the Romans knew how to move water. If anything else, they could move water anywhere they wanted to. But along this way, again, if you remember in Ephesus, as we went down the street in Ephesus, there are all these shops along the main road. Well, this is the main road, and these are shops again that are all along this main road. This is an illustration of what they believed it probably would have looked like at some point. Would have been beautiful, would have been an amazing place in a very, very important city. I don't know if you can tell in on those, well, yeah, you can see it better here. Those stones that have the crosses, that would have been an indication that Christians would have probably been involved with whatever was being sold in that small little shop alongside the road at some point. And all throughout this part of the city, there's graffiti. You see there is a carving of a cross, and you'll see these all over the place. Once Christianity became influential after the Emperor Constantine, and you begin to see Christianity really explode. And as a matter of fact, Constantine, almost in the way that the Romans were persecuting Christians to not worship Jesus, Constantine put a lot of pressure on Roman citizens to worship Jesus. And not quite to the same persecution, but there was a lot of political pressure even then. And a lot of the traditions that we have today started with Constantine. A Sunday morning sermon, that started with Constantine. That isn't something that we see happening in Scripture in the first century church. They got together every first day of the week and they studied Scripture and they prayed and they sang and they worshiped. But the practice of having people come in and sit and having somebody stand up and deliver a message one time a week, that was a way to try to draw as many Roman citizens in to come in and be a part of the church. And it started in the days of Constantine. There's a lot of things like that you go back through history, you see. Was it a bad thing? Is it a bad thing? No. But understanding kind of the history of it sometimes helps us to put into perspective the things that we're doing. This was the Roman bath that was built there in the city. Is the biggest structure that remains that the archaeologists have been able to reconstruct in that area. If you walk through that on one side there was hot bath, on the other side there was a cold bath, and in the back there was one of the largest pools that has ever been uncovered in the Roman world. This massive pool, part of that Roman bath. And originally that would have been all under roof. It would have been all indoors. And the roof is all collapsed now, but it would have been an incredible structure to see at that time. Along with all of this, they have discovered the remains of the largest Jewish synagogue ever found outside of Israel. And just to the left, so here's the Roman bath, right here is that synagogue. This is aerial. I was able to find some aerial shots from online, which you could not do now because now it has a roof covering it to protect it. But I thought that was interesting. This was just a few years ago that they got some of these shots. So that's a look from one end of the synagogue looking down to the other end. We're going to walk in. You see the ornate floors again. We saw that in Ephesus. In the Roman homes, they used that a lot here as well. It showed wealth. It showed status. Even within the synagogue, they didn't suffer for money. Those floors go all over. There's a laver that was discovered for them to wash ceremonially. Get more of the floors, just amazing work. On the far end, this would have been the area where they would have gathered. So that's the seating area. You go and you sit on the stone or the marble steps, and where then there would be teaching and things that would go on here in this part of the synagogue. This proved that there's a very significant Jewish population in Sardis, and which obviously would have paved the way for Christianity to be introduced in this community. And so, even with all of this, Sardis struggled to regain its important status in the Roman Empire. And in 26 AD, the city of Sardis actually applied for permission to build an imperial cult temple, a temple to worship the emperor. And the Roman Empire denied their request. They said that they did not, the city did not have the status or the wealth to be able to hold a temple for the emperor. However, Sardis did have a temple to Artemis. The temple to Artemis that we saw in Ephesus, that there wasn't really much left of it, one column standing out in the middle of a field. But this temple was quite impressive as well. As a matter of fact, it's one of three, the one in Ephesus, there was one here in Sardis, and then there was one also in Magnesia. The one here in Sardis is the most well preserved of the three. And you just see at one point when that was fully constructed, white marble shining, just the landscape, just the beauty of it all. You can see just the way that the Romans did everything was incredible. But this was actually said to be the fourth most significant temple of all temples in ancient times. And what's interesting is that there are dozens of crosses that and other Christian symbols that have been carved into the stones of this temple as well. It's a little bit washed out, but there's a cross there. Right here was also a cross. There's another one up here. You can't really see. But again, this is an indication that the temple eventually became the location of a church. It is believed, which happened a lot. A lot of times pagan temples after Constantine and Christianity was legalized and the pagan worship began to decrease. They have these massive buildings and nothing to do with them anymore because they're not worshiping their pagan gods anymore. And so those temples many times were used as church buildings, for places for the church to meet. You just see some of what's left of this temple. This the artwork in the columns, everything around. That is what is called I believe architrave, I believe is what it's called. You have the big massive pillars. That piece that sat on top of the pillars, went across both pillars, I think it's called an architrave. But that's Denny Petrillo. Denny's not a really tall guy, but he's not really little either. And you can just see how massive that thing is. Solid marble. And that was sitting probably about 20 feet high up on two of those columns. How did they do that in that time? No idea. But behind that, to the right, you see a brick wall. And that, they also discovered a Byzantine church. This was built the 600s, the 5th century, on the southeast corner of the temple site. And again, just even more evidence of the church of Christianity that was a part of the community in Sardis. But still, Christ declares that this church was dead. We see Christianity, we see the influence of everywhere around Sardis. It seems that the church in Sardis had been living behind a false reputation. They were looking like they were active. They looked like they were influential. But ultimately, they had not let go of the world around them. And that was something that Sardis was known for, its wealth, its prominence because of its wealth. So because of that, spiritually, it was dead. Even the church, probably meeting in that massive building that was that would have been an amazing church building at one point, but spiritually they were dead. So Jesus is trying to shock them into realizing the condition that they're in. And it's almost as if he is describing a church that has just become complacent. They had fallen into the habit of just maintaining church, of not focusing on what Jesus had really called them to do and be. And maybe resting on their past laurels. And Jesus, we know, is aware of what a church has done, what a church is not doing. And as we saw in Revelation 3 and verse 2 again, Jesus said, "Wake up and strengthen the things that remained, which are about to die. For I have not found your deeds completed in the sight of my God." And so where most of the letters of the 7 churches, they speak of the persecution and they speak of the false teaching that has caused the problems, we see that's not what the issue is here in Sardis. Jesus is dealing with another problem. He's dealing with an internal problem of a mindset of the type of Christians that these people have become. And the problem there was a complacency where they convinced themselves that they were doing good and they had a great relationship in the community. But remember those big crosses in the marketplace? You couldn't do that in Ephesus. You couldn't do that in Pergamum, but you could do that in Sardis. Christians had a good reputation in their community. But the danger within Sardis was within and getting too comfortable with what they had lost. They'd lost their zeal. And they had members who were well known, who were influential in the community, but they had lost their vision. They'd lost their passion to continue to grow and do the work of the church. And in this letter, Jesus exposes the appearances for what they really are. On the outside, you look alive. but there's not much going on. You say, okay, you have a nice building. Okay, you have wealthy members. Okay, you have respect in the city. But what are you doing for me? My work is no longer your first priority. And, I think we find a lot of churches in our country that would fit into the mold of a Sardis. Churches that have become comfortable with who they are. We've been in that community for a long time. We have a lot of important people from the community that know us. But we're no longer doing the work and continuing to spread the message of the gospel. Therefore, Jesus has the admonition to wake up. The church in Sardis had fallen asleep. It had dozed off, leaving itself vulnerable for other influences. One writer called this spiritual lethargy, which Jesus says is spiritual death. He says, you look alive, but you're dead. As a church can continue to carry on the religious rituals, continue to look like it's alive, but in fact be dead in the eyes of God. That's, I think, something important for us to make sure that we pay attention to. However, not everybody in the church in Sardis had been influenced by all this. In Revelation 3 and verse 4, Jesus continues, he says, but you have a few people in Sardis who have not soiled their garments, and they will walk with me in white, for they are worthy. So once again, we saw last week, we made a little mention of those in Thyatira, but here it points to it even more. We see the idea that just because you're in a church that's not being the church that Jesus wants it to be, does not mean that the Christians within that church are automatically seen by Jesus as problematic. You may be worshiping in a church where things are not right, where they're not holding to the biblical standard. But as an individual, Christ knows you. He knows what you believe, where you stand, what your convictions are. And Jesus, he very specifically mentions it here in Sardis. To the church as a whole, and most likely these letters being written to the leadership of the churches, saying, you guys are dead. You're dead to me. But there are some that are worshiping with you who are not dead. There are some who are there who are still alive. Jesus knows those within even unbiblical and unsound churches who are living and doing what he desires for them to do. And so to those, Jesus says in verse 5, he says, he who overcomes will thus be clothed in white garments, and I will not erase his name from the book of life, and I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. And so Jesus speaking to those saying, I know it's tough. I know it's hard. And the influence even within the church, the influence around you has not been good. But for those who overcome, you will still receive my reward. Stay strong. Don't give up. And that's what Jesus continues to encourage those Christians. Today, we have the ability to just jump a few blocks, something going on within a church. We can just go down the street and we can find another church and look to see, is this a church that is teaching and acting and being what Christ wants it to be? And that doesn't mean necessarily we need to leave the one. If everybody leaves it that has the right mindset, then what are the chances that that will ever turn around? Now, it's a challenge to get things to turn around anyway, but it becomes less likely to ever happen. But sometimes we know that it's needed, maybe for a family reason, for other reasons. Things get too bad, and in our world, you can just find another place. But in their time, they couldn't. It was a long way to go to another church, and so here we see them sticking it out, and just simply being what Christ needed them to be, even individually, even if as a church they weren't. I think it gives encouragement to all of us. So